We just finished Shivat BeTamuz here in Israel, and I know you are in the midst of it. And it's important, I think, when we go through these days, these national days, that we think about what's the meaning behind them, not just to sort of go through our year and go through the life cycle, the Jewish life cycle, but to really think about what is the significance of this particular day, and how does it impact me? So that's what we're going to be talking about. The title of this talk was why are we still mourning? And I think it's very important question to ask ourselves. So today, Yud Zayin Tammuz begins the 3 week period that leads up to Tisha B'Av. We all know that there were terrible tragedies that befell the Jewish people on this day. 5 of them the Mishnah lists, one being Moshe breaking the Luchot after the Jews were engaged in Masa Egel, the golden calf. Another was the cessation of the daily korban that used to be brought during the first temple, the Tamid, that was also not continued on this day, a very sad day. We know that during the second temple period, Apastamos, the Roman general, burned the Sefer Torah in public and put an idol in the midst of the temple, meaning many, and not to mention, of course, the day that we are all commemorating today, which is the breach of the walls of the second temple period. Now, all these things befell us on this day. So wake up in the morning, we think, wow, this is a tough day. And what are we taking away from this? So even though there are many things that we are commemorating on this day that are sad, on the other hand, I wonder if you feel this feeling of like, well, do we still have to think about this? Meaning, this happened so long ago. We're talking about 2,000 years ago, by Rishon, 1,950 years ago, by Sheni, 2,020 years ago. 2 temples were destroyed on this day. But really, does it impact us so much today? Should it impact us? And I think that that's really a very important question that we have to ask ourselves. And what's interesting, and I think I'm going to try, I don't know if I should, I think I'm going to try to share my screen a minute. I wonder if I should do that. Actually, I think I am not. I think I am, one second, let me see if I could do this easily enough. No, I cannot do it. Okay. So the Navi Zechariah, in the Navi Zechariah, the question was asked whether or not we should continue to mourn during the second temple period for the first, from the first temple period. Should we mourn for the second? Meaning, the Jews come to Zechariah from Bavel, from Galut, and they ask, should I even bother continuing to do the mourning practices? Because what was about to happen? It was about to happen. We were 2 years away from building the second temple. So why should the first temple was destroyed, we understand, but now we have the second temple. Should we continue the practice of mourning? And even then, the question was answered in the affirmative, but I'm going to get back to that a little bit later. But first, what I would like to do is actually talk a little bit about and sorry, before I get to that, people also say, today there's Israel. If there's Israel, why are we still mourning? Meaning, yes, the temple was destroyed, but look at Israel today. It's flourishing. It's a powerhouse. It's a growing, thriving, powerful nation that's living here. So do we still have to mourn about things that happened so very long ago? So with that in mind, and knowing that this question had been asked before, I thought we would look at a couple of things. The first thing I wanted to look at actually is the structure of this 3-week period, because I think it tells us a lot about how we feel or how we should be feeling just within the structure itself. So we know again that this day, Yud Zayin Tammuz, is starting off this 3-week period of mourning, which culminates in Tisha B'Av, which is the saddest day on the Jewish calendar. And when we look at this period of mourning, we distinguish between 2 periods. Actually, I'm repeating what Rav Soloveitchik brought to our attention, this idea of what we call Avelut Yeshana, as opposed to Avelut Chadasha, mourning that is considered ancient and mourning that is considered new. So the mourning that we are all engaged in now on a national level, which involves the entire nation, is considered Avelut Yeshana. This is considered an ancient form of mourning. And we see that the progression of this mourning goes from what's most lenient to what's more strict. So for instance, now the parties stop. And as we go further and further into the mourning period, we're going to be, people are going to be refraining from haircuts. From Rosh Chodesh Av, they're not going to be having meat and wine. From Shavua Shechaba, which is the week of Tisha B'Av, there's no laundry. And there's a few halachot that make us get into a more severe sense of mourning as we approach and as we get closer to Tisha B'Av. As opposed to this type of ancient mourning, and nobody should know from this, but if a person has experienced personal loss, the laws of Avelut are actually the opposite, where the first week of mourning is the most severe and the most stringent, where a mourner is not allowed to do many things, has to focus on the mourning state. And then that mourning period is less stringent as the month goes by and less stringent as the full year goes by. So what we see here from this distinction that Rav Soloveitchik makes between ancient mourning and recent mourning is there's an inversion. Whereas in the ancient mourning cycle, it's a gradual process going from more lenient to strict, going from light to darkness, as it were. In the recent mourning, it's going from strict to more lenient, or from despair to hope, which actually follows a person's natural grieving process in an individual loss. So, and by the way, the Chachamim describe that when we get to Tisha B'Av, it's as if a person has to feel, right? They're on the day of fasting, they have to feel as if, God forbid, the Gemara describes, as if a relative is lying before him, meaning as if he or she himself had lost somebody. And that's a process that we get to, but it doesn't come naturally. And so I think that the Chachamim chose this particular model of ancient mourning in order to sort of help us get into the mood, help us feel a sense of recreating these feelings of loss, which I don't know about you guys, but for me, it has to be recreated. It's not something that I automatically feel, especially because the Beit HaMikdash was never part of my life to begin with. But so Chazal implemented this type of a gradual process so that the events from the past could actually have an impact on us, so that we could sort of move back in time, as it were, to connect to the feelings of the past, even though this is a very counterintuitive thing, because as we move away from an event, we become less and less affected by it. Time heals, right? And here, the Chachamim are asking us to actually go against our nature and go back into this feeling of what befell Jewish people then, because we know, and I've said this before in my own classes, that the Jewish people are an organic whole. We're very connected to our previous generations and of course to the future generations. So we experience life almost as a unit. Harambam talks about this as well, where he says that even though we're not suffering now, let's say in our generation, we don't have a calamity of this magnitude, he says we still have to observe the fast days. Why? Because we're relating our present experiences to the past. So that even when we said earlier that the Jews came and asked during Bayit Sheni, do we really have to continue these practices? And even when the Jews had permission not to continue the practices, they actually did. They did continue it because other events occur on this day, even if it wasn't the actual Churban Bayit Sheni, the actual destruction of the Second Temple. And even though there's the rebuilding of the Beit HaMikdash that was going on during that time, still in all, we connect ourselves to the Jewish people as a whole in time. And the purpose of the fast, according to Rambam, and the purpose of all fasts, is really to get us to introspect and really to get us to think very deeply about who we are and where we're going and what's our role to play. So we're gonna talk a little bit more about that. But now I just want to move to an interesting point also about the Second Temple. Those of us who remember, the Second Temple did not look as grand as the First Temple. There were differences between the two. And if we look back in the sources, which we don't have time to do right now, but it was a festive occasion. Finally, the second Beit HaMikdash is being built, but something interesting happened. and Sefer Ezra actually describes that the elders were actually weeping and crying at the time that the second Beit Hamikdash was built. And the reason that they were crying is because they remembered what the first Beit Hamikdash. Remember, there was 70 years between the first and the second. And there were differences that we know of. There wasn't the same presence of God in the second Beit Hamikdash. They didn't have the Aron, the Kaparat, the Kruvim. The connection with God was different. There was no Urim between. There were many differences between the two Batei Hamikdash. So the elders in the time of Ezra, they were crying about it. They were crying because they remembered what it was like, and they realized that it wasn't like that. Not just was the physical building different, but also the actual tragedy itself was unanswered. Meaning the national tragedy of the first Beit Hamikdash, where thousands, millions were killed. It's a very big question that went unanswered. The question being, why do bad things happen to good people? Right? The same question that comes up over and over in every generation. So the elders during the Second Temple period were crying because the events, even though they were happy, they still remembered what was difficult. What was difficult then, during the time of the first Beit Hamikdash, remained difficult still during the Second Temple period. So as long as God's will was obscure and we don't understand historical events, the question that, by the way, when we read Megillat Echa on Tisha B'Av is going to try and discuss is, again, this whole question of how such tragedies and difficult things happen in life. And as long as the elders did not have an answer to that question, they were unable to be fully happy about the event. Okay, in another source in the Gemara, it says that every generation in which the temple has not been rebuilt, it's considered as if that generation is responsible for its destruction. That's a very damning statement. That means that every generation that we don't see rebuilding of the temple, then it's as if we were responsible for it. So that's a tough one. I don't know. I have a hard time with that one, but I hear it. But basically what essentially that Gemara is trying to teach us is that if whatever was wrong in the past had not been corrected in our generation, then it's those past roots that are brought into the present, and therefore our generation doesn't see the rebuilding. It's as if the Gemara is trying to explain we are theoretically deserving of having had the Beit HaMikdash destroyed in our generation. Meaning, if we haven't gotten to the root of what went wrong then, if we haven't been able to correct it, then our generation is responsible. And that's, I think, part of an answer, beginning of an answer to why we mourn today. Because there's still work to be done. There's still the root causes of why we lost our temple, and how are we supposed to now go about fixing it. That's part of our responsibility in this generation. So it's not only about them. Today is not just a historical event. We're commemorating a history that happened then. According to Harambam, according to what we're learning today, this is very much a present situation, something that we have to think about very deeply. And I hope by the end of this small talk, we'll each walk away with some sort of a tangible feeling of what it is that we can do to actually change it. So I think I want to just move now. I don't know how much time we have. I want to move a little bit faster. Okay. So what are the things actually that we could do today? We can actually talk a little bit about that. Well, first of all, people I mentioned earlier often ask the question, if we have Israel today, so really, do we have to continue this? We said this earlier. So while it's very true that we have a national revival going on here, there are things that are still missing. We're not fully in the time of the Geulah. We're not fully in the time of the redemption, although there are many people that do believe, myself included, that we're actually getting there. Like we're in this process. What are some of the things that are missing? Well, we don't have the Beit HaMikdash that we know. We don't have the Sanhedrin. The Sanhedrin was that judicial body that was responsible for making sure that law and order was, preserved. We don't have God's presence in the way that it used to be here. Although everybody who comes to Israel does often tell me that they feel God's presence very much so. But more importantly, or equally as important, is this idea that the question of suffering still exists. And when we talk about getting to a time of a messianic time, yes, we're talking about the personality of Mashiach, and yes, we're talking about Israel being sovereign in its own country, which has already begun to happen. But more than that, when we talk about messianic times, we're talking about a time of tremendous peace, of universal peace. We're talking about a time when the nations of the world are going to really recognize the Torah. Not that they will all turn into Jews, but they will recognize the essential values of the Torah. As the Pasuk says, Ki mitzion tetzeh Torah udvar Hashem Yerushalayim. From Jerusalem, we're going to have the word of God go out to the world. And those of us who have had the privilege of actually living in the Old City have actually seen this with our own eyes, where we've seen people from all across the world coming through the Old City of Jerusalem on pilgrimages and seeking spiritual guidance. So this idea of messianic times, we're not 100% there yet, but yet there are many signs that are pointing in that direction. So when we talk about learning lessons from the past in order to shape our present and our future, we think about what it is that happened in the generation of the Beit HaMikdash that didn't go well, and we try to see how we can actually change that in our present time in order to get to this messianic era, which is where all of world history is going. Those of you who've seen the UN building know that the verse that's on the building is actually this idea of messianic era, the pasuk from Yeshaya that says there's going to be no more war, and they're going to turn the weapons into plowshares, and it's going to be a time of universal peace. So these are some of the reasons that we're still mourning today, because even though we're in this process, hopefully, of making the world a better place, we haven't yet reached the ideal. And there is redemption on a physical level to a certain extent. I think I've heard that maybe 50% of world Jewry is now living in Israel. We're getting to this point of what we call kibbutz galuyot, of Jews all gathering together as we pray for every day, gathering together to be here in Israel. So even though on a physical level, there is a certain amount of redemption that we see before our very eyes, the spiritual is we're still working on the spiritual redemption, which involves alleviating suffering. We're working on that. I actually have to add, I say this every class, I feel like, but in front of our school building in the Old City, there's another pasuk from Zechariah that says that children are going to play in the streets of Yerushalayim, and the elderly are going to be sitting and enjoying being in the city. And that is something that's not taken for granted. Anybody who knows the history of Jerusalem, of Israel, knows that just 100 years ago it was completely barren, and during the time of the Ottoman Empire it was just like a backwater type of a place that nobody really paid so much attention to. So the idea that we've come this far definitely gives us hope that we're really getting close to our national mission. So just to like sort of pull things together, to summarize. So we began with the question of why are we still mourning? Because really we're, thank God, in a very different place than we were thousands of years ago. And yet the Rav teaches us through his distinction between ancient mourning and recent mourning that we do have to connect to our past events and to our past generations. And Rambam relates that by connecting to these past events, they become as if they are in the present, and we work to make them better. We work to correct whatever it is that we can in order to lead ourselves to a better future. And the idea that during the time of the Second Temple, there was still weeping going on, even though there had been the second building, or the second building was imminent, because similar to today, we're in this process, but yet we're not fully there. So we basically are mourning until we have the fulfillment of both the physical and the spiritual redemption that we're looking for in every generation. So much so that we said that the Gemara implies that a generation that didn't see the rebuilding of the temple in its time, it's as if they were responsible for its destruction because they haven't yet fulfilled or corrected or done what they could in order to be deserving of having the temple. So I just wanted to see if I can share my screen. I'm going to try one more time, but I don't know if I can. No, it doesn't let me share. Okay, fine. So I'm going to leave it. I had a bunch of sources that I wanted to share with you, but I'll skip them for now. Okay, the last part then that I wanted to mention. So we leave this conversation by saying, okay, we understand that we're all a whole and that we're all connected. And we understand that it's not just about the history, but it's about what's happening today. And I think everybody needs to take a very good look around them, a good look at society today. And say what's going right, what's not, and what's my place in fixing that. And I think this is very much what it means to be part of what we call Am Nivchar, or the chosen nation. We're not just going through our lives physically, eating, drinking, exercising, having a job, raising a family. That we're doing all of that, but we're trying also to think of our higher purpose as it was, both on an individual level and on a national level. And being part of the Jewish people is exactly that. Am Nivchar, chosen people. What are we chosen for? So I think it's very difficult, but definitely very fulfilling to be able to say that my everyday existence has to somehow contribute to making the world a better place. And that's essentially what we are bidden to do as individuals and as part of the Jewish people. And I say this very often, that anybody who looks at what Israel has accomplished in terms of going out and making the world a better place, whether they're sending irrigation ideas, helping communities in Africa with electricity, with irrigation, or the medical discoveries or whatever scientific discoveries are being made here on a daily basis. And that shows how the Jewish people are not just here in Israel living for ourselves. It's not just about this is a piece of real estate that we have to get to and all live here and then it's our home and that's it. It's this idea that the country is a platform for us to now take our talents and take whatever contributions we have as a people and bring it to the rest of the world, whether it's through science, whether it's through any and all discoveries that we've had. What about our morals, the morals of the Jewish people? This is something that is not often highlighted, but it should be. The morals of this people when it comes to the army, when it comes to the way we treat one another, hopefully in the best possible way. These can be model examples for the rest of the world. I mean, I don't know another army that actually announces ahead of time, if God forbid we have to engage in war, leaflets in Arabic are going down to tell people to move away so that they don't get hurt. This is a type of morality that is not seen in the world, and it's something that is the possession of the Jewish people, the idea that we are Am Nivchar, we are the chosen nation, but we're not chosen to be just inherently superior, and we weren't given this land just in order to live here, but we have a national mission. And I think this is very, very, very much tied to today, Shiva Asar BeTamuz, going on and culminating in Tisha B'Av. Because what if we took these 3 weeks and we really thought about how each of us in our own way, we don't have to all be scientists, but each of us in our own way is making progress to make the world a happier place, a better place, a more moral place, so that we actually fulfill our mission of being a light unto the nations. And the temple was essentially that. When we think about the temple, we're talking about a place of meeting between the physical world and the spiritual world. And we should know, by the way, that not just Jews were invited there, non-Jews as well were able to come and to pray. And so I think using these 3 weeks to think about how the Jewish people are supposed to be on the world stage, and the temple was just that. It was a magnificent building, everyone knew about it, and it was a point of meeting between earth, heaven and earth. So can we do that today, even without the Beit HaMikdash? Can we somehow bridge this gap between the physical and the spiritual? Can we help in our own lives show others that there's more to life than just the physical, that the spiritual is here, and that God created us and wants us to fulfill our lives' missions? Can we do that each on an individual level, and also obviously on a national level? I think if we succeeded in answering those questions, and hopefully in the affirmative, then we will understand why we're still mourning today, because the work is not done. And Bezrat Hashem, I wish all of us that we should continue to grow and to be the best that we can be in every generation, so that, God willing, one day very soon, we're going to be able to actually witness the complete redemption, the complete rebuilding of the Beit HaMikdash, and this era of universal peace that we all so desperately need and crave. Thank you all very, very much. I really appreciate having to have had this time with you. And I'd love to hear any comments. Feel free to write to me, and I'd love to respond. Wishing you guys the rest of an easy fast.